Go ahead and get started. I want to thank everybody for coming out today. I'm Blaine Schubert. I'm the director of the Natural History Museum. Our first speaker of the day is Dr. Joseph Baker, who's in the Department of, Sociology and Anthropology?
That's right.
That's right. I can't remember which way it is, but it's Sociology and Anthropology. And he's going to tell you about some of his research. Today we're celebrating Darwin Day. We're celebrating science. And so there's going to be a few different things that happen. First is going to be his talk about basically the evolution of creationism. How did creationism come about? Following that, we're going to have a panel discussion by myself, Jacqueline Luck, and John Shuck about religion and science in today's society. There are other activities going on around the museum. Later this afternoon, there will also be a video that's shown in here. It's called What Darwin Never Knew. If you've never seen this video, that's something we'll be showing. It talks a lot about building on Charles Darwin's ideas. So it's a fun-filled day. Again, thank you all for coming, and we look forward to hearing your talk, Joseph.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming out. So basically what I want to do today, let's see if we can get this to work. Let's see. All right. So I'm actually talking about creationism. I know this is Darwin Day, but I'm basically outlining different versions of creationism, when they come about, sort of what they look like, and how they have started, or how they began, and now how they influence the public. And so there's sort of three sections to this. I'm going to outline through history some of the different ways that these ideas have come about and been articulated. Then I'll show you some pictures from Ken Ham's Creation Museum close to Cincinnati. We have some extensive pictures from that, so you can kind of see what a contemporary young Earth position looks like. And then I'll talk about public opinion. And what percentage of Americans believe certain things about evolution and creation. And so that's kind of the model of it and how we'll do it. All right, so creation myths are found cross-culturally amongst nearly all peoples. That is, almost all people groups have some sense of where they come from and typically some narrative about that. And so what this does is it kind of gives the answer to the question, how did we get here? And this is a very deep existential question that people want to know the answer to. And sort of how this gets articulated usually slots people into the groups that they belong. Now, I also want to point out that this idea of the argument from design has a long philosophical and sort of theological history, especially in Christianity, this idea of sort of a clockmaker and design and this kind of thing. We'll talk about intelligent design at the end, and intelligent design sort of picks up on this and makes it into a new form. Now, an argument that I'll make here, and this comes, as I'll talk about in a minute, from a sort of a very famous anthropologist, is that monotheism, especially if you have a very, omniscient, monotheistic God, nearly requires this. So if you have an omniscient, all-powerful, monotheistic God, the question of where did we come from almost necessarily is God. The answer is the answer to that question. Now, how, separate issue, right? So people may express how in different ways. But the idea is that monotheism almost sort of requires some sort of creation myth. And what these narratives do is they temporally, that is in time, orient people into their groups and give them a sense of a timeline. Where do we come from and where are we going? All right? So I want to give you an example. Okay? So I'm going to read for just a minute. I'll let some pictures show. I'm just going to read you a creation myth and let you think about it as I talk about it. All right. He is an immortal and indeed eternal being, since he is derived from no other. Moreover, he has power over the stars. It is he who set them up, and he who orders them about. It is he who causes lightning to leap forth from the clouds and who hurls thunder. He is the creator. He is called the father of men and is said to have made them. He made the first man in the following manner. He made a statuette out of clay, breathed into its nostrils, and the statuette came alive and began to walk. At the same time as he made men, this divine personage made the animals and the trees. All the arts of life, tools, language, rituals, are thanks to him. He is the benefactor of humanity. It is he who provides his own with all that is needful in their existence. And being at the same time the guardian of morality, he punishes when morality is violated. Furthermore, he performs the function of judge after death, distinguishing between the good and the bad, and not treating both the same. In any event, he is the gatekeeper for the land of the dead, welcoming the souls when they arrive in the beyond. All right. So what I'm hoping in sort of reading this to you is that it sounds familiar, right? It has a very familiar sound to it, some familiar themes. This is an excerpt from The Elementary Forms of Religious Life by Emil Durkheim, who is something of the most important figure in my field of the sociology of religion. But what's more important about this is the myth that I read to you is from the Arunta, who are Aboriginal Australians. And even more than this, it's not just the Arunta who have this myth. Durkheim says that he's doing a sort of a comparative study of Aboriginal religions, and he says among groups that have a supreme monotheistic God, they have this myth. So if they have sort of a supreme God, one who is above all others, they have a myth that has these themes. And so this is his argument, that monotheism gives us this particular myth. Now, again, the reason I read it to you is because presumably it sounds just like one you have heard and contemporary sort of creation myths. But so this is nothing new, I guess is the way to say it. All right, so until Darwin's work, and I'll show you evidence of this in just a second, the words creationist or creationism basically never appear in texts. And that is because they are taken for granted. That is, some form of creation is taken for granted. You don't necessarily have to articulate an ideology if everybody already assumes it. So, but what Darwin's work does is it challenges creation and sort of leads people to come up with more formalized versions of a creationist myth. Or to, how shall I say this? It forces them to make an argument back. You don't have to make an argument back until someone makes an argument to you. So in effect, creation is taken for granted, right? So most people would assume it. And this is my general argument. This is my theme. Changes in the sociocultural environment produce changes in the ideology of creation, especially, as we'll talk about in a minute, political, legal. Changes to the political and legal environments really produce changes in the expression of creations. All right. So we get a new species of ideas, creationism. That is, there's no ism or creationist until we get Darwin. All right, now here's my evidence of this. Has anybody ever used Google Ngrams? All right, Google Ngrams are super cool. What they do is anything that's been scanned into Google Books, it reads the text in. And so you can search and see how prevalent words have been over time. So for instance, and this is what I'll do, is I'll check to see when do the words creationism or creationist begin to appear in texts. And what it does is it allows you to put in multiple terms and compare them to one another. Now I'm going to apologize ahead of time. I can only get a screenshot of this. Google won't give you the graph. I have some data nerd friends who will fetch this data for you, but it's quite difficult to get. I know it's very small, but the red line right here is either creationism or creationist, both put together. So what percentage of books do these words appear in? And the answer before 1860, which is right here, is basically none. But this is Darwin's work, and you can actually see that here's the beginning of creationism, and we get a spike in the 80s. But it doesn't appear, that is, it never is there until Darwin's work comes first. So it's sort of a response. Now the other terms I've put on here, this is intelligent design, or the specific phrase argument from design. Okay? This down here is creation science, or scientific creationism. Up here, the orange one is human evolution. Just how much are people talking about the issue of human evolution? Now here's scopes, a tiny blip on the creationist map here. We'll talk about scopes briefly. Last year at this talk, I did a lot about the scopes trial. We won't cover it too much this year. We'll talk about it briefly. But you get a tiny blip here and talk about creationism. Here, the rise of quote-unquote creation science. is basically whenever, and I'll talk about this. So basically what my talk is going to do is kind of go through this timeline. But creation science comes about as a response to sort of the ruling out of laws that sort of strike down fanning evolution. And so creation science is a new expression to say you need equal time for evolution science and creation science. But the phrase creation science we don't get until about 1970. And the person really responsible for this is Henry Morris, and I'll talk about him in a minute. So this is the equal time period, you could call it. Now right here is a Supreme Court case. This is Edwards v. Aguillard. And what this Supreme Court case does is strike down equal time as being unconstitutional. So as soon as that is struck down as unconstitutional, we get the rise of intelligent design. So this is a direct response to the legal change. So the legal change that says creation science won't work as a political or policy strategy switches gears to intelligent design as the policy strategy. And I've got more evidence of this later. But again, you should play around with Google Ngrams. They're fascinating. You can just type in anything you want and see if it's been showing up in books. It's a really cool, and it's free. You got to love that. Okay. So soon after Darwin's ideas come out, you begin to get different expressions of creationism. Right away, you begin to get what are called gap, day-age, and theistic evolution versions. The gap version of creationism says that there's a big time lapse between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and that allows sort of a longer time span before, and then humans arrive fully formed really in sort of recent time. Day-age, which we'll hear more about with William Jennings Bryan here in a minute, is the idea that when the Bible says a day, it could be millennia. What's a day to God, right? And so this allows sort of an old earth, a longer timeline creationism. And then you have sort of the theistic evolution, the idea that people are accepting the ideas of evolution, but still positing God as having a hand over its sort of operation. Now what you'll notice is missing from here is young eartherism. And that's because there really is no young eartherism right away. There are a handful of ministers who put forward the idea of young eartherism, but it's almost non-existent. Sort of the authoritative historian on this is Ronald Numbers, and he is sort of hard-pressed to come up with examples of young eartherism right away because it's not around. So we don't have very many young earth creationists. And there is little to no mention of this idea of catastrophist ideas. So what we'll talk about later, flood geology, this idea of sort of the flood being responsible for geologic formations in the fossil record. And these ideas have not come about yet. So we don't have really young earth creationism yet in its form. But the movement of premillennialism, that is people who believe in sort of the imminent coming, the second coming, is the group theologically where we get the idea of young earth creationism. And when I talk about it here in just a minute, I'll give you the example. The most prominent example, the person whose ideas you heard debated the other night if you watched Ken Ham and Bill Nye the Science Guy, is George McCready Price, who was a Seventh-day Adventist. And Adventists have a sort of a condensed timeline, and they have a reason for having a literal reading of Genesis because that's where they get the idea that the Sabbath is Saturday and not Sunday. But they also have the idea that there's a sort of an imminent second coming, so they have a condensed timeline. All right, so this is George McCready Price here. He's a Seventh-day Adventist, a dispensationalist. Again, the idea that there's an imminent second coming, that it will be soon. And he, in his sense, he believed that he may even see the return of Jesus in his lifetime. But he's an armchair geologist, and let me be clear about this. He's not trained as a geologist. There's no training as a geologist, but what he does is he reads tons and tons of geology and finds ways to argue against its long timeline. So he is the first person who gives us the idea of a young earth creationism and defends it in a scientific language. That is, he uses the rhetoric of science to defend the idea of a condensed timeline. So when you hear people talking about young earth creationism now, you are actually hearing McCready's ideas. Now, he may not get credit for it. You probably have never heard of him before. But these are his ideas. And he is a prolific author, so these are some of his works. And frankly, this is only a few of them. But you'll notice that they are all focused on geology. So he starts with Illogical Geology, Fundamentals of Geology. He authors the first creationist textbook in 1923, the New Geology textbook. And here you can actually see we get the language of flood geology, flood theory of geology. So all these ideas are really coming from McCready Price. And I'm going to include one of his last books on here because it's particularly interesting, and that is The Greatest of Prophets, a new commentary on the book of Daniel. He's particularly interested in Daniel and Revelation because those are the books that he says tell us about the imminent second coming. And so what Price has is a condensed historical timeline and a condensed future timeline. And the idea is that sort of after the fall, humanity is living in the end days and the second coming is near. And so if I could summarize McCready Price, which is not easy, he's a very diverse fellow. He has a discontinuous, cataclysmic, condensed timeline of both history and the future. All right? So he has this idea that there's sort of the one big flood, and that is what is responsible for the fossil record and formations and all these things. And so these ideas that you hear are his. All right, now here's another example. William Jennings Bryan, who you have probably heard of, famous in the Scopes trial. He was the 3-time Democratic nominee for the presidency, Secretary of State for Woodrow Wilson. Known as a great commoner, he's a populist, a very prominent politician, and he is actually somebody who changed the way presidents campaign. He is one of the first people to take it to the people, to get on trains and go across the country and deliver stump speeches and do this kind of thing. Now, he never won the presidency, but he is a very influential politician. And let me give you the backdrop of Bryan and Darrow at the Scopes trial. So, at the end of Bryan's life, he decides that his last political campaign, the last thing he wants to accomplish, is to get evolution out of schools and out of textbooks. And his reason is this, that evolution can lead to the idea of social Darwinism. His concern is social Darwinism and sort of concern for the poor and the common people, and the idea that social Darwinism would give an ideology a justification for not caring for the least among us. That's the easiest way to put it. He was also convinced that evolution was responsible for the ideology of the Germans in World War I. And so he has a very particular view of evolution and how it relates to morality that will be different from the one I'll show later with contemporary creationism. But he's concerned about social Darwinism. So Bryan, what he does is he goes to states and he campaigns essentially to try to get states to pass laws that ban the teaching of evolution. And he is successful in a handful of states like Florida and Tennessee. Now in Tennessee, what happens is the newly minted ACLU, at this time the ACLU has just been formed, it has never won a case, and it is looking for publicity, and so it advertises in the newspaper asking for someone who's willing to challenge this law. They end up finding sort of a willing patsy in John Scopes, and the ACLU will provide your defense. This is sort of the deal. So Scopes says he'll do this and take the defense. Now the person who ends up coming to defend him is Clarence Darrow. Darrow at this time is the most famous trial attorney in the United States. His most famous case was Leopold and Loeb, who were young men who murdered someone. And he defended them, had them plead guilty, and then put forth an impassioned plea against the death penalty. But Darrow is the most famous trial lawyer at the time. So Darrow comes down to sort of be the lead for the defense. Now, interestingly, Bryan, who was trained as a lawyer but hasn't practiced as a lawyer in decades, agrees to be the lead attorney for the prosecution. All right, so for Bryan actually not only helps pass the law, but he's going to be the one to help prosecute it. So you essentially have Darrow and Bryan on opposite sides of the Scopes trial. Now, in one of the strangest twists you will ever hear in a trial, throughout the course of this, it takes a few days, and Darrow has assembled some of the most prominent scientists of the day to come and defend evolution. The judge will not allow them to testify because he says, this is not about evolution as a theory. This is about whether or not John Scopes taught evolution. That's the law. And so he will not allow those scientists to testify. But Darrow is wily as a fox, if nothing else. And so he says, well, if you won't allow me to call experts on science, I will call an expert on the Bible. So I call William Jennings Bryan to come as an expert on the Bible. So what you have here is actually the lead defense attorney calling the lead prosecuting attorney to the witness stand for a cross-examination. Again, super strange. Now, Bryan could have gotten out of this, but he was too proud and said, if this agnostic wants to ask me questions, he can ask me questions all day long. And this is what we remember from the Scopes trial, is the exchange between Darrow and Bryan, sort of the voice of fundamentalism as it's remembered, against the voice of modernism and agnosticism. Now, the courtroom is so packed for this, there's no way to understate how much of a media circus this was. And so they had to move the trial outside. So it's actually happening out on the lawn. So out on the lawn is the exchange between Darrow and Bryan. All right, now, to give you a sense of two things, that is, what is Bryan's position on the age of the earth, and the other, what is the banter like in this exchange? I've asked my good friend Michael here to help me read an excerpt from the trial. So Michael is going to be Darrow, and I will be William Jennings Bryan, and Kate will be the judge. Now, so I'm gonna let some pictures play up here because we're terrible actors, and you don't want to look at us while we're doing this. So you can look at them doing it and just listen to us talk about it. All right. So let's get this going here. All right. And technically, here, let me see. I should be sitting, really, because if I'm going to be Bryan, I should be sitting. All right.
Have you any idea how old the Earth is?
No.
The book you've introduced in evidence tells you, doesn't it?
I don't think it does, Mr. Darrow.
Let's see whether it does. Is this the one?
Well, that's the one, I think.
It says BC 4004?
But that is Bishop Ussher's calculation.
That is printed in the Bible you introduced.
Well, yes, sir, but...
Would you say that the Earth was only 4,000 years old?
Oh, no. I think it is much older than that.
How much?
I couldn't say.
Do you say whether the Bible itself says it is older than that?
I don't think it is older or not.
Do you think the Earth was made in 6 days?
Not 6 days of 24 hours.
Doesn't it say so?
My impression is that they were periods, but I would not argue against someone who wanted to believe in literal days.
Have you any idea of the length of the periods?
No, I don't.
Do you think the sun was made on the 4th day?
Yes.
And they had evening and morning without the sun?
I'm simply saying it was a period.
They had evening and morning for 4 periods without the sun, do you think?
I believe in creation as told. And even if I'm not able to explain it, I will believe it. And I think it would be just as easy for the kind of God that we believe in to make the earth in 6 years, 6,000 years, 6 million years, or 600 million years.
Are you about through, Mr. Darrow?
I want to ask a few more questions about the creation.
I will believe just what the Bible says, and I ask you to put your questions in the language of the Bible. I prefer that to your language. Read the Bible, and I will answer.
All right, let me read from the Bible. And the Lord God said unto the serpent, Because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle, and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. Do you think that is why the serpent is compelled to crawl upon its belly?
I believe that.
Have you any idea how the snake went before that time?
No, sir.
Do you know whether he walked on his tail or not?
No, I have no way to know.
Now, you refer to the cloud that was put in heaven after the flood, the rainbow. Do you believe in that?
Read it.
All right, Mr. Bryan, I will read it for you.
Your Honor, I think I can cut this testimony short. The only purpose Mr. Darrow has is to slur at the Bible. And I will answer his questions, and I will answer them all at once. I want the world to know that this man who does not believe in God is trying to use a court in Tennessee
I object to that.
Slur at the Bible, and it will require time, but I'm willing to take it.
I object to your statement. I am exempting you on your fool ideas that no intelligent Christian on earth believes.
Court is adjourned until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Thank you, Michael. All right. So, there's two things in there, and one of the important ones is that Bryan actually says he believes in an old earth version of creationism. He cites McCready Price as an expert at one point in the trial, and Darrow hammers him on it and says, that man is a charlatan. No geologist in the world will accept that. And he says, you couldn't name another scientist who agrees with your ideas. And so eventually Bryan admits that he's an old earth creationist and alienates many of his supporters. That is, so for the rest of his life, McCready Price says that Bryan sold out creationism by giving away the age of the earth. So really, though, Bryan is in sort of an old earth believer. But that is not how he will be remembered, as I'll show in a minute. Now, Bryan dies 5 days after the trial ends. He dies almost immediately after the trial. But really, it changes nothing about the law, and the laws stay on the books. The laws banning the teaching of evolution stay on the books for the next 40 years. So it doesn't really change the legal landscape. It changes the cultural landscape. Northern newspapers and Eastern newspapers portray Bryan as sort of the buffoon, the fundamentalist, and Darrow as sort of the hero. It's the inverse in the South, who portray Bryan as the defender of faith and the common people. But what happens is states actually don't want this publicity. So they put pressure on textbooks, the publishers of textbooks, to take stuff about evolution out because they don't really want to deal with this. And so for the most part, evolution is removed from most textbooks in high school, so it's kind of downplayed. Now, I should be clear that scientists go on about their work using evolution. It's just not in textbooks. And you get a smattering of state and local laws. For instance, Arkansas passes a statute that says you can't teach evolution. That'll be important later because that gets challenged. But this is pretty much how it stays. So you have 4 or 5 states that have laws about this, and this is kind of where it stands after that. This, combined with the repeal of prohibition, people sort of credit as being Protestant fundamentalism taking a less prominent role in the sort of political sphere. But what happens is they begin to build extensive subcultural infrastructure. So an example is Bryan College is founded in Dayton, Tennessee, 5 years after the trial. And this is just one example. So now that we get lots of new schools that are sort of from a Protestant, conservative Protestant background, and this infrastructure becomes important later for what we'll talk about in contemporary period. Now in 47 and 48, Supreme Court cases apply the Establishment Clause to the states. And these cases are about school prayer and religious instruction. And what they are doing now is saying that the Establishment Clause, that is to say that the state shall make no establishment of religion, is not just federal, but also at the state level. And what this does is set the precedent or establish the foundation for people to once again challenge the evolution banning laws on the grounds that they have a religious sort of reason. Their justification is purely religious. So this sort of sets the stage for a new fight about evolution and teaching it in schools. All right, the Genesis flood. So this is McCready Price redo. So in 1961, Henry Morris, who was a hydroengineer professor at Virginia Tech, authors a book called The Genesis Flood, and he authors it with a fundamentalist theologian. And now the theologian, it was his book to begin with, but in the end, Morris's view sort of takes it over. And what Morris does is articulate for a new audience and a new generation a scientific defense of young earth creationism. And they are repackaging McCready Price's ideas so much that they are really concerned about being linked with him, so they really don't cite him. They leave him out, even though they are self-conscious. They talk to McCready Price before they publish their book, and so they know what they're doing, but they also don't want to be quickly banished as being just like Price. But they're repackaging his ideas. This is the book. It's called Biblical Record and Its Scientific Implications. It's by Whitcomb and Morris. And Morris, along with some people who are sympathetic to his work, found what becomes the Institution for Creation Research. Now, ICR is kind of like the biggest media wing for young earth creationism. Last year, I went to a talk. Somebody came to ETSU's campus from ICR. They go give public talks and answer questions. They have extensive mailing and media. They're sort of the most important young earth creationist wing. And what they're doing is using scientific rhetoric to justify young Earth creationism. So what I want to do is play you a quick clip from them. It's a minute long, but it gives you a sense, if you look at all the scientific images that are going on in it, of sort of how they are packaging their idea. So I hope the sound works. I tried it beforehand and it did, so I have high hopes.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. If Genesis is wrong, the Bible is flawed and faith is misguided. At the Institute for Creation Research, we have spent more than 4 decades researching the science behind Genesis, and our conclusions verify that God did create all things. Our science staff researches the gamut of origins evidence, from geological formations of the earth to human-chimp DNA similarities, from the discoveries of soft tissues in dinosaur fossils to the mysteries of galaxies, quantum mechanics, and dark matter. And when the evidence is gathered and analyzed, it becomes clear that science confirms the accuracy of Scripture. Put the power of truth to work in your life. Explore the evidence at ICR.
Okay. You get the idea. It's very sciencey. We do lots of test tubes and triangles. So it's very sciencey. But it's important because this rhetoric becomes integral to sort of how they're going to make their case. Now, what they're arguing for is a condensed timeline that humans and dinosaurs existed at the same time. There were dinosaurs on the ark. And so this is, again, this is sort of the new version of this. But what happens here in a minute, which we'll talk about, when the Supreme Court rules that those evolution banning laws are unconstitutional, this becomes the new tactic, is to say it's creation science, it's not creationism, it's creation science. So Epperson versus Arkansas is the important case here. This is another Supreme Court case. Susan Epperson was a biology teacher in Arkansas, and she essentially is challenging the law in Arkansas that says that evolution cannot be taught in public schools. And SCOTUS sides with her case and says that these state laws banning evolution are unconstitutional because they're explicitly religious in character. All right, now I'm going to talk about, so this gives us the rise of creation science, and then I'll talk about how creation science transitions into intelligent design. So this is going to be a little small, but if you want a summary of creation science, a good way to look at it is, so they struck down the law in Arkansas, so then a few years later, Arkansas passed a law requiring equal time. So this is an equal time law, and this is how they define scientific creationism. So this is a good summary. Sudden creation of the universe, energy, and life from nothing. Insufficiency of mutation and natural selection in bringing about the development of all living kinds from a single organism. Changes only within limits of originally created kinds of plants and animals. This is the thing that some people will talk about, the difference between macroevolution versus microevolution. That is, they'll allow some small changes in species, but not for one species to transition into another. Separate ancestry of humans and apes. An explanation of the Earth's geology by catastrophism, including the occurrence of a worldwide flood. So this is not the multiple catastrophes of like extinction of dinosaurs. This is one global worldwide flood responsible for all different kinds of things. And a relatively recent inception of the Earth and living kinds at this short timeline, 10,000 years or less. So these are really the tenets of creation science, and this is the law that passes requiring equal time between creation science and evolution science. Now, the Supreme Court will ultimately rule, actually I should be clear about this, Mclain versus Arkansas, this one gets struck down at the state level, and then later an equal time law from Louisiana makes it to the Supreme Court, and that is struck down as well for being unconstitutional, and the ruling is essentially that creation science is religious and not scientific. But as soon, and I mean as soon as Edwards v. Aguillard occurs, we get intelligent design. So, and I'll show you the example of this here. All right, so this is the textbook that became Of Pandas and People, the intelligent design text that would become the center of the Kitzmiller case. I'll talk about in just a second. But so these are different iterations of the book. So here's 83, 86, 87, and this is important, version 1. And so this is how much the word creationism or creationist is used in the book. Now, they put out the same text puts out an edition later in the year in which there are no mentions of creationism, and there are a bunch of mentions of intelligent design. So it's almost like the Supreme Court case, as soon as it happens, transitions the language from creation science to ID. And so, again, this argument that changes to the socio-political environment sort of produce some changes in the expression of creationism. Now, you could argue that it's the same thing in new form, and it is, but it's sort of a change in language, a change in rhetoric, a change in tactic. And I have to point this out because it's sort of a funny thing. Now, in the Kitzmiller case, they actually subpoenaed the old editions of the book, that is the draft editions, and they were able to find an edition in which they'd basically gone through and tried to search and replace creationism and put in design proponents. But in one instance of the draft, they didn't quite get it done. They put in design proponents in the middle of the word creationist, and they made the word see design proponent. Let's see if I can do this. Proponentists. Some people have called this the transitional form between creation science and intelligent design. It's the missing link, so to speak. And this actually becomes kind of like the smoking gun at the court trial to say that, look, they just did a replace. So this is Kitzmiller versus Dover where they find this. This is in 2004, a Pennsylvania school district requires teaching ID equal time. And a group of parents bring suit. Again, the ACLU shows back up to side with the parents. This is a Pandas and People, the book in question. And a conservative justice appointed by George W. Bush rules that ID is explicitly religious, that it's basically a new form of creationism, and therefore it violates the Establishment Clause based on the precedent of all the previous cases. All right? So ID kind of goes down here, but we're not done. So again, my argument is that these shifts in the socio-political environment give you new expressions. So after ID goes down, the current strategy now is teach the controversy. And so the language is about teaching the controversy about evolution. And so in this way, you don't have to talk about creationism at all. You can just say we're going to teach the controversy about evolution. So an example, welcome to Tennessee. Tennessee passed a bill in 2012, and the actual language of the law is, and there's so many sciences in here, I got to make sure I get it right, to teach the scientific strengths and scientific weaknesses of scientific theories. But there's no mention of evolution. There's no mention of creation. And this is actually an interesting new strategy that allows you to question all kinds of things, no matter any kind of controversial things. So you could challenge climate change, or you could challenge evolution, or whatever it may be. And the way these are pitched, the way they're talked about and advocated is academic freedom. They're academic freedom bills. And Louisiana has one of these. And so this is kind of the new phase. This is the new strategy. All right, now here's a summary. This is by Eugenie Scott, who's a famous evolution advocate and sort of creation watcher. And she sort of summarizes these as the different positions people may take on evolution and creation. Flat eartherism, I hear there are some of people around. I haven't seen them. I have gotten mailings from geocentrists. If you get some more, I'd love to have them. But so there are some geocentrists, but really, young earth creationism to materialist evolution is where most people fall on this. In young earth creationism, we kind of know what it is. We've talked about gap and day age. Progressive is sort of the last stop where they're making a distinction between micro and macro evolution. And this is the argument that God created species in bursts, and so that you don't have to have transitions between species. Past this, you have evolutionary creationism and theistic evolutionism, and the difference here is just how much of a role God plays. So in the one that's more theistic, evolutionary creationism, the idea is that evolution, they'll accept evolution, but that it is God changing the forms each time to get us closer to humanity. So God plays a very active role in the process. Now, in theistic evolutionism, this is more like a clockmaker God who sort of sets evolution in place and spins it loose and lets it go. And so God is not actively doing things throughout the process. He starts it and then lets it run. Then we move down to agnostic evolution. This would just be, don't know if there's a God. In materialist evolution, this is sort of like the Dawkins position. And intelligent design, interestingly, sort of can cover all of these different forms of creationism because it's not real explicit in its language. Now, I'll talk about in just a minute. The Ken Ham group is wary of ID. because it's almost a little too progressive for them. I like this chart because this chart makes the point that I'm going to make about the Creation Museum that I'm going to show you some pictures from. And that is that the question of evolution and creationism is political. It's about politics. And so this is no God, and these are scientific creationists chopping down the tree of biological evolution. And up here, there's all kinds of different things. Frankly, my favorite one is sex education, which has a stick of dynamite on it. I'm not really sure I understand the picture on that one. But you can see there's humanism, suicide, socialism, terrorism, dirty books. So this is my transition to talk about the Creation Museum. So if you watch the Ken Ham, Bill Nye debate, this is where that took place. And it's in Petersburg, Kentucky, just outside of Cincinnati. And it's run by Answers in Genesis. I've got some books up here if you want to check them out after we're done. Answers in Genesis is kind of the main book that Ken Ham puts forth. And his organization is called Answers in Genesis. And what this does, this museum, is it combines political, theological, and scientific language and arguments. It sort of rolls them into one. So they're very explicit about their theology. That is, they're not sort of hiding the fact that this is religious. They also use sort of McCready Price's science arguments, but they also put politics in, and I'll show you how they do that. All right, so this is young Earth creationism. So that's what this sort of represents. All right, so when you first go in, you start with the idea of the coexistence of humans and dinosaurs here. This is right in the very beginning of it. And this is their model that they use to sort of walk you through the museum. So you have these stages, and the museum follows these stages. So creation, corruption, catastrophe, confusion, Christ, cross, consummation. It's nice, alliterative. And there's 7 of them for the days. So you actually start with a sort of an example of a geological dig, or sort of a diagram of a dig. And so you got people finding bones, and it kind of looks like a standard site, but all around it are these things that sort of set up the motif for the rest of the museum, and that is this. Same facts, different views, why? And so almost all of their diagrams work on this premise. And they love diagrams, and they have some great diagrams, I have to say. So here's something playing right next to it. It says, because of our different starting points. The starting points is sort of the basic thing they're going to try to communicate. Again, I could show you 30 of these. I'm only going to show you like 4. But this is the one that underlies them. So this is one where they have this side over here that says God's words. They give you the sort of this young Earth creationist account of something, in this case the universe, versus sort of the standard science account. And they do this for all different kinds of topics, but they all function in this way. They're split, and they sort of have their side and the other side. You can see some more next to me here. Now, this transition, and here's the segue into the political dimension of this. So you kind of go from this idea of science and digging and this kind of thing, and there's this section where it really, we'll call it the existential strife room. Where there are pictures of all these different issues, right? So you got the kid here with arguing parents, you have death, you have loneliness, you have catastrophe, and this is actually what transitions you into what, for my money, is the center of the museum. And you can see these kids are saying, I didn't hear about this in school, let's go see the rest of it. And behind them here are all these existential questions, but why are we here? Why was I born this way? Why do I feel so bad? Why do we die? And so they're kind of priming you. Now, really, this takes you into what is, I guess you call it like the apex of it, which is like the sort of the heart of the argument here. And that is the corruption. All right? So here's a picture, and the things that are on the tombstones: Genesis, God's word, truth, and God is dead. And now here, this is fascinating, right? Because this is a picture of the Scopes trial. And we see Bryan, who is lionized as defending the Bible. Again, if you remember, he was a day-ager, an old earther. But that's lost here. He's sort of represented as defending young eartherism. And again, this is actually right next to the idea of that corruption mural. All right, now we actually move. This is the real heart of it. Okay, so there are two of these walls. This one has magazine covers where there's talk of Big Bang Theory or evolution or genetics or religion and science and this kind of thing. And so they have these sort of plastered here. And then right next to it here is the political argument. All right? Now, it's hard to find what's in here, so let me point it out for you, right? Prayer in schools. There's prayer in schools as the topic that's right up here. School shootings right here. Abortion right here. Stem cell research. Homosexuality. AIDS. Gay marriage here as well. Assisted suicide. And so what you see here is that sort of the heart of the argument is actually sexual politics and bioethics. So sexual politics and bioethics is really what is sort of the root of the conflict here. Now this is much different from the idea of, say, social Darwinism. So in this way, sort of the political, it's always been political, but it's a different political topic in this way. And this kind of came about, this merger of creationism with sexual politics issues really in the 70s and 80s and sort of the rise of the religious right and sort of the merger of those things. And euthanasia. Again, bioethics is really the thing. Now, it's hard to read this, so right next to this was a door, and it looks like it's been carved in with a knife, and this says, "The world's not safe anymore," and it has all these locks on it. So again, there's sort of the idea that the world is corrupt and fallen. And from here, I didn't put pictures of this because they're hard to see. You walk through a dimly lit corridor, and there are videos playing. And one of them is about a girl who's thinking about having an abortion. And one of them is about a boy who's watching pornography. And one of them is about a woman who's thinking about getting a divorce. And so these vignettes are playing, and you can kind of stop and watch them as you proceed through it. And then you move into this room where, again, they're sort of displaying suffering in all its forms. This doesn't really need explanation. You can see it for yourself. And this, I'll have to explain this. I could not get a good picture of this. I tried. What this is they have projectors putting up on concrete pillars. There are things like Nazi rallies and genocide, and they're just sort of displaying all these scenes of intense death and suffering. And they're being projected by these projectors in the corner. Now, when I turned around to take this picture, people started looking at me funny because they started to figure out that I was like trying to see what the process was instead of just taking a picture of the scene. But from here, so this is kind of the end of the suffering portion. So you move from the suffering portion into sort of the diagram of how creation happens. This is a nice video room that shows you the 7 days of creation and how it comes about. And then you move out into this beautiful room, this sort of white light of creationism. And they have these lovely pictures of nature and animals and fish and all these different kinds of things. And it's all very well lit and beautiful. You can see here sort of the layout of it. So you kind of move out of this death and suffering into the light, so to speak. Then we move into the Adam and Eve portion of it. Here they are in the garden. This is one of my favorite pictures I got here. So putting it right here. Now, right under this, too, you see on the diagram that's underneath this display is the Doctrine of Marriage. So the special creation of Adam and Eve is the foundation of marriage. One man, one woman, the oneness of marriage. Right next to this is the idea that this says, Eve was not made from dust at the side of Adam. God made male and female fit for different roles from the beginning. My wife was kind enough to go through this museum with me. I pointed out to her that this might mean some extra headship for me. For those of you who don't know her, that's her sarcastic face. Then you move into sort of the portion that is about the Ark. And I have to say this. Is this Phil Robertson? It doesn't look like him. And here's some raptors on the Ark. And I love the picture. Keith, back there. Thank you, Keith, for taking this picture. Children 12 years and under. But you can't put a limit on joy, can you? And I've already suggested to Blaine that he get a taper here that people can ride. And this may be the most important part of the museum is their extensive gift shop. So they have books on anything you can think of. The media is crucially important here. And so they've got all kinds of the standard things you'd find in gift shops. This one's about dragons. When we happened to be there, they were saying the argument they were making was that dragon myths show that humans and dinosaurs coexisted. So I've got the book up here if you want to look at it. They had extensive sort of dragon displays, fire-breathing dragon. Now, this is probably the most important part, curricula. And they have got a ton of curricula packages that they sell for homeschooling, private religious schools, all these different things. And so this is actually how the influence of young earth creationism is sort of spread. All right, now, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to summarize and tell you what percentage of Americans believe certain things. I know I'm running long. My expertise in this is actually public opinion. So if you're interested in that, please talk to me afterwards, but I want to make sure we leave time for the panel. So my argument is that consumption of media and social networks are the key to this. It's what you read about and how you think about it. And some of my research shows this, that it's not about how your level of education. If you have a certain religious identity, the more education you have, the more creationist you are because you seek out these materials. And so religious identity is the driver of the effect of education. This is kind of one of my main claims. But I'm a sociologist, so we understand knowledge is being constituted in communities. We would call them interpretive communities. And so the diffusion of these ideas through media is sort of central to what ICR or Answers in Genesis does. But again, my bigger argument is that you have to understand these groups as still being oriented in socio-political fields. They're making political arguments. They have political sort of contestants, people who combat what they say, and so that actually sometimes shapes what they say. All right. I call this, I'll just give you the numbers. I like to call this lies, damn lies, and statistics. This is a sort of quote made famous by Mark Twain, but I'm a statistician, so, you know. I'll just show you the numbers. All right, so one thing that is most consistent, no matter how you ask about it, 42% of Americans espouse young earth creationism, at least on a survey. These are nationally representative surveys. This is the GSS, the General Social Survey, the best one we've got in my field. This is Pew, who's also good. This number has not changed since the 80s when we started looking at this. 40%. It's right at 40%. It's pretty consistent. And these are people who say God created humans in their present form in the last 10,000 years. Right? So young earth creationism. Now, how you ask about it is really important to what you get. The GSS gives you these options right up front. Young earth creationism, theistic evolution, or non-theistic evolution. This one over here, frankly, this graph is from a book we're doing about methods, so I'll spare you that for now. But the GSS is more reliable. So about 12% of people are non-theistic evolution, that is evolution, but God was not guiding it. About 41% are God-guided evolution, and then you've got a handful of people at the top who don't know. The Pew Religion Public Life used a 2-question option that confused people and gave much different answers. My point with this was to show you that if I wanted to, I could mislead you very easily. And I'm not duplicitous about this, but if I was, boy, could I. All right, so I guess we'll stop on this section here because I know I'm out of time. I don't want to go over. If people want to know about public opinion, again, that is my main interest. I'll do one more. Let me show you this. I apologize. I'll apologize.
Go ahead, Joseph.
So, one thing that is interesting here is that it's not theism or atheism. It's what you think God is. Right? So, this was the argument of some of my mentors, and their argument is this. 90 to 95% of Americans believe in God. So if I know you believe in God, that doesn't tell me much about you. But if I know what you think God is, that's a different question. And so the idea of an engaged God, like how often and how much is God actively engaging the material world? And so this actually turns out to be the thing that gives us a really good indicator into evolution creationism positions. So down here are people who have what I call distant God. Perhaps you don't like that term, maybe a non-engaged God. Spinoza's God. Spins the world loose and lets it go. but isn't changing stoplights and answering petitionary prayer. Up here is sort of people who respond to a bunch of different questions about God is concerned with my well-being, he answers my prayers directly, does these kinds of things. And so basically the distant God people agree with evolution, and the strongly disagree with evolution people are very active God. Very active God. So they have this very sort of engaged, active image of God. It's the inverse for creationism and whether or not it should be taught in public schools. And again, this holds controlling for a range of other factors like religiosity, religious tradition, views of the Bible, political identity, etc. So part of the argument I would say is that it's not atheism or theism, it's type of theism that seems to matter. All right, so I'll stop there. I gotta give my references here and give director of photography Keith Pilkey and my leading thespian Michael Palou. I'm happy to answer questions if anybody's got questions. I apologize for being long-winded. Yeah. Anybody? Nobody? Yeah.
So I'm a little confused by those last two charts.
Yeah.
I'm thinking the last one you were saying that 75% of the people surveyed were for teaching creationism in schools?
Yeah, no, I'm sorry about that. On that left column it's just their score on an index of engaged God. So the percentage of people who are for teaching creationism in schools is 42%. And that's a nationally representative survey. Yeah, the thing on the left was actually your score on an index of engaged God. Yeah. I know I'm sorry I had to skip that, but I know everybody would rather see the pictures of creationism than listen to me talk about my public opinion surveys. Yes.
What is the link between Christian Reconstructionism and creationism?
So Reconstructionism is much rarer, right? There aren't nearly as many people who would be Reconstructionists as would be young Earthers. And I'm not sure about like Reconstructionists, what their position. I assume they're just anti-evolution, but I haven't studied them specifically. But yeah, Reconstructionism is sort of a really small subfraction of that. There are many people, like I said, 2 out of 5 who are young Earth creationists, at least by this metric. Anybody else? Yeah.
On your answer of the 42%, did you consider the educational level of the people in there?
Yes, indeed. So the 42% tells you just overall, so out of all Americans. Now, here's how education actually makes a difference. So I've actually got something here I can show you how education matters for creationism. And this is actually some of my research on this, is to talk about how education matters. So it turns out that, so let's say if I just run education as a correlation with creationism, you get nothing. Like it comes back flatline. And why is because people who are biblical literalists, the more education they have, the more creationist they are. People who have more interpretive views of the Bible or who say the Bible is not divine, education makes you much less likely. So they go in opposite directions. So if you don't split out the effects of education by religious identity, it looks like nothing, but it's actually sort of flipped. So So the strongest predictor is actually these things combined, a multiplicative of education and Bible identity, and it looks like this. So these are people who say the Bible is history and legends, that is, who are sort of disavowing its divine form. And more education, especially college grad, makes you less likely to support creationism. Here's the human error. So these are people who say that the Bible is divinely true, divinely inspired, but it has human error. Again, something of a negative effect of education. The Bible is perfectly true, but we must interpret its meaning. Here it's positive, so more education means more support for creationism, and for literalists, that is, the Bible is literally true, word for word, on all topics. It's a pretty strong positive. And so down here, this is less than high school grad, some college or college grad. And so depending on your religious identity, it goes different ways. So education matters, but it matters in conjunction with religious identity. Yes.
Earlier in your presentation, you had mentioned about the law that was recently passed in Tennessee, 2012, of academic freedom.
Yes.
Could you share a little bit of where that is now? Is that going through the courts, or is there an argument of biology teachers don't have to teach that, but if we bring it into another venue rather than biology or don't teach it as science, then it's okay?
Sure. It is law. It was passed into law. Haslam didn't sign it, but it went into law. He was wary of signing it, but he let it pass into law. I don't know if anybody is challenging it through the court system right now. I'm not sure about that. But you can absolutely teach creationism or any other type of religion if you're in a religions class. You know what I mean? Like if you're teaching comparative religion or like sociology of religion, my field, you can absolutely teach those things. Even in public school you can. But it just can't be sort of in the science classroom, essentially. I don't know about the legal challenge. I should check that out to see if anybody's trying to take that law down. It'll be trickier because they set it up so that it does not have religious language in it anywhere. There's no religious language in this at all. So it'll be a different question.